Well, I think it's particularly important in the EU context because people are so distant from them, and so many citizens in the member states really don't understand what goes on at EU level. Obviously they know very well what happens with their national parliaments, national governments, but the EU seems remote, and the EU tends to use language which is quite exclusionary, and therefore I think it's even more important at EU level that the decision making is transparent. There are so many ways in which the EU decision-making process could be made more transparent. I think there are difficulties with the current transparency regulation, for example. I think it's too weak at the moment, and I think it gives a lot of the power to the institutions in relation to records that are being released. And people who aren't happy with decisions that are made have to go to court, and obviously that's a very long and a very expensive process. Also, one of the ways in which policy is developed in the EU is through a process called trialogue, which is quite a difficult and process in one way to understand, but what it basically means, it's when the horse trading, if you like, takes place between the European Parliament and the Commission and the Council in relation to legislation. And while it can be a very efficient process in that, because they all get together in rooms and they deal with amendments and they get through work quite efficiently, and it means that the legislative process isn't slowed down, it's not transparent. It's very difficult to find out about the trilogue meetings. It's very difficult to get records subsequently about what happened. So it's a balance between efficiency and transparency. But sometimes the piece of policy that's proposed goes into the trilogue looking like this, and it comes out looking completely differently. So people need to see, well, what happens when it's within the trilogue process, and who particularly is influencing that process, who's influencing the Parliament, who's influencing the Commission, and who's influencing the Council. I think it's an element of good administration to have records of how decisions are made. I think that's simply a basic rule, and therefore I think it is important that records be kept of meetings. Now, I think there always has to be space, as there is in any good transparency regime, for the deliberative process. I mean, people do have to have freedom at a certain point in the process of policy making to be free to share views, to be candid and so on. But I think once the decisions have been made, then certainly those records be released. And it's very important, however, that records are kept, because these are historical documents as well. Well, I think the key to that is making people aware of how lobbying is done, the extent of it and the importance of it. I think a lot of insiders in the Brussels bubble, shall we say, are aware of what happens. But I'm not sure that a lot of officials, and particularly junior officials, many of whom are charged with working on particular dossiers or so on, are aware of how sophisticated the process is. And one of the things I have suggested is that all officials, be it in the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, be instructed and be given masterclasses in the sophisticated business of lobbying. I mean, I think that this will help them to make proper decisions. I think it will help them to make good decisions in relation to meet and so on. But I also think it's very important that the transparency register, which is not mandatory at the moment, be made mandatory. I think it should be given a legal basis, and I think it should include the Council and the Perm Reps and so on, the representatives of the member states, and not just the Parliament and the Commission. Because again, it's even more important that lobbying be transparent at this level, and decision making be at this level, because people from the member state find it very difficult to see it, and the only way that they'll see it is if there are very high levels of transparency within the EU institutions. And I think the transparency register, if it is really supposed to do what is intended to do, needs to be beefed up. It needs to be given a legislative basis, and it needs very much to be made mandatory. I also think that the questions that are asked, the information that is given to the transparency register in relation to the organisations or the individuals who are lobbying, we should know on whose behalf they're lobbying. We should also know how they're funded, because once you learn even a little bit about lobbying in Brussels, you realise that very often it's it's not companies or corporates or whatever business themselves who are doing the direct lobbying, but sometimes these front organisations are set up. So you get, the European Association of such and such a thing, or names and titles are given to groupings that appear quite innocent in one sense, but very often when you dig a little deeper, you see they're actually being funded by a particular interest. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but we should know, who exactly is doing the lobbying, and more importantly, and who is funding them, because only then can we make decisions about the type of policy that has been making, and whether we feel that the policies have been appropriately influenced. Well, I think that the onus should be on the institutions to make it clear that in the interests of the public and in the interests of transparency and accountability, that certain rules will be applied as to who they meet and the conditions on which they will meet them. And I think that rules, allowing obviously for certain particular situations, commercial sensitivity or so on, should include that their names will be out there automatically. And they should know that if they want to submit documents in order to influence a policy play, which is entirely legitimate, that those documents will be made public. Perhaps not immediately if there is a particular sensitivity around it, but the principle should be that all documents that relate to how a particular policy has been informed should, at a certain stage, be released and made public. Yeah, I think my office has and will continue to play quite a significant role. I mean, one of the biggest areas that we've dealt with over the last 20 years has been around transparency. And since I took office 18 months ago, that again is something that I've majored on. I've launched a series of own initiative investigations, many of them that have really at their heart lobbying and the influencing of policy. One of it is around TTIP, the big EU-US trade deal, and with recommendations to make that process a lot more transparent in terms of releasing records. Another relates to the expert groups who advise the Commission in relation to policy. We want to know that they're independent and that there is balance in relation to their composition. Another one, and again this relates to lobbying and influencing rather than lobbying, I suppose influencing might be a better word, relates to what's known in Brussels as the revolving door phenomenon, whereby very often senior officials are in possession of a lot of very important information from the various areas within the Commission, go into private industry. They're very attractive, particularly if they're working in an area like of regulation, where the regulation or the laws passed will have a big impact on the commercial bottom lines of companies. So what we've looked at there is how the Commission in particular deals with potential conflict of interest. We believe they have to be a lot tougher in relation to that. And one of I suppose the most strongest, if you like, and possibly the most controversial, I don't see it as controversial, but others might, a recommendation that I've made is in relation to an online register, proposal that the Commission have an online register, as they have, for example, in the UK, whereby senior officials who are moving over to the private sector, that you can see who they are, what work they did in their previous work in the Commission, where they're going to, and in a general way, what dossier over in the private industry they'll be working on, and what limitations, if any, have been put on their work. And I think that will achieve a number of things. It will have an impact on people who choose to make that move, and it will heighten their awareness of the importance of avoiding conflict of interest. And I also think it'll involve civil society a lot more in terms of being able to see themselves what's going on, and therefore inform the public, and I think that's very important. But I've also made, when I've been speaking to Commissioner Georgieva in particular, and indeed Vice President Timmermans about this, and indeed Commission President Juncker, that there's an actual business case in relation to this. It's not just a moral case or an ethical case, there's a business case. Just as no commissioner would allow somebody to come in and rifle through their files or hack their computers. Nobody should allow very key, important, sensitive commercial and other information move from the Commission into a private into the private sector, into a special interest, essentially through the brain and the knowledge of the person who has left. And there's a business case to be made for that, and I think that to me it'll be a marker of how concerned, if you like, the Commission is about transparency, which I believe it is, but how hard they're going to work to make greater strides in relation to transparency is whether they accept this particular recommendation. Now, there are, I've been told, data protection issues, but I think sometimes data protection can be used as a way of avoiding transparency. People forget that, you know, that there's no such thing as an absolute right. There's no absolute right to transparency. There's no absolute right either to having your data protected, even if it is personal data. The public interest always has to be considered. And I think part of what I'm trying to achieve, and I think part of what any ombudsman does, is to sort of bring in a sort of a culture shift, so that instead of reaching for the data protection manual whenever an issue comes up, the first thought that comes into people's heads is what's in the public interest here, and then try and make everything else fit.